we had a long series of online lectures over the spring of 2021. And since the summer already arrived, this would be the last, as was already mentioned, the last but not least lecture of Joshua First, whom I will introduce in a few minutes. But before we start, I'd like to emphasize that this project is realized in cooperation with the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. And we had this idea to combine together two spaces which are normally envisaged or imagined as separate spaces, namely to combine cities and the mountains, or this remote landscape, which is normally somehow imagined as a kind of almost like a Mars, something very remote. And over this project, we tried to emphasize that actually the current, or let's say modern, after the second half of 19th century, imagination about Carpathian Mountains is rather very urban. It was shaped in the cities, it was made by urban dwellers, and then the landscape itself of Carpathian Mountains influenced a lot urban imagination. We will have the last event at the Center for Urban History at the end of this month. This would be a seminar which will combine several participants from abroad, but mainly Ukrainian participants. And this will be offline event. That's why we hope that the whole series will have these two dimensions, the online and then offline. And another one dimension of this project is a small publication of a special issue of a journal called Xenios. Sorry for misinterpretation. It comes from the Pont Euxinos, the old name of the Black Sea. Yes, and this is the magazine which is published by the University of St. Gallen, and they kindly agreed to have a special edition where we, Center for Urban History and Joshua First, who will be lecturing today, agreed to be editors, like guest editors, and this would be already the final thing to make for this project. Okay. This said, I go back to our today's presenter. Dr. Joshua First is teaching at the University of Mississippi currently, but he received his PhD in history from the University of Michigan in 2008. Now he is a Croft Associate Professor of History and International Studies at the University of Mississippi, and his field of specialization is Eastern Europe, but more specifically Ukraine and Russian history. And Joshua First spent some years researching Ukrainian cinema, mainly in Kiev, but he wrote a beautiful book which is dedicated to poetic cinema, and the title of this book is Ukrainian Cinema, Belonging and Identity During the Soviet Soul. This book appeared in 2014, right during the calamities and political events that happened in current Ukraine. And it also gave us very beautiful examples of Soviet Ukrainian history and how in its continuation and very interesting connection to the mountains. Those who don't know, I just want to emphasize that the Carpathian Mountains, even though being inscribed to some point into Ukrainian imagination, in reality came into Soviet Ukraine only after 1939. And for many people in Soviet Ukraine in that time, Carpathians were the same exotic as Ural Mountains. So it was not really different. This imagination had to be developed, and Soviet powers made a lot to develop this imagination. And for the lecture of Dr. Joshua First, we will have today a filmmaker, Oleg Chorny, whom I will introduce after the lecture, whose father and he himself worked for the Dovzhenko studios, and also they participated in this imaginary construction, let's say, of Soviet Ukraine. So the title of today's lecture is Mountains and Meaning, Imagining the Carpathians in Soviet Ukrainian Cinema during the 60s and the 70s. And Joshua, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Shamilovich. Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Svetlana, for interpreting. Can everybody hear me okay? My mic is good. Okay, great. Anyway, greetings from Mississippi. That was a wonderful introduction, Bodan. You know, a lot of the issues that you brought up at the very end of your introduction, I'm going to address here. I hope in a meaningful way. I'm obviously sad I can't be with you all over there, and I'm holding out hope for a trip to Ukraine next year. Let's hope that we beat this whole COVID thing. So anyway, my interest in the Carpathians came through an already existing, I guess, obsession with Soviet cinema going back to when I was, I think, in middle school, when I was about in 7th grade. But I really didn't begin thinking about Ukraine until I was in graduate school, again, at the University of Michigan, right around actually the time that the Orange Revolution was happening. I went to Kyiv in January of 2005. Was there for the inauguration of President Ivchenko, which was very exciting at the time. I was starting work on my dissertation research on Ukrainian cinema. I was doing work in the Центральный архив литературы и мистецтва and some other archives in Kyiv. I had really very few expectations of what I would find in my research about Ukrainian cinema, but the thing that really stood out in the archives, and this is what I was really led to, the thing that really stood out in the archives and in the films themselves was the fascination with the mountains in this body of work. What I started referring to as Carpathophilia in my dissertation, and that term sort of made it into the book itself. And in general, my book on Ukrainian cinema, which I like to think is much bigger than a discussion of Ukrainian poetic cinema, but I think most people kind of read it as an understanding of, as an interpretation of that, probably most famous movement that comes out of Ukrainian cinema. So anyway, my book sought to understand this phenomenon as a way of countering Russification by defamiliarizing the Ukrainian landscape in the cinema. And I'll talk about how that works in a couple of what I think of as unexpected films from the late 1960s. And I also, but here, because again, I mean, this book, it's like 6 years old at this point. So I wanted to broaden the framework a little bit for what I'm calling mountains and meaning, to show that what Ukrainian filmmakers were doing in the 1960s was part of a global and trans-historical fascination with terra incognita in order to construct a national, or what I'm calling a nationalist ecology. And like all nationalist ecologies, they involve a politics of the gaze, a politics of looking, a politics that involves certain people looking and a certain other. And that other could be humans, it could be animals, or it could be a kind of ecosystem in its totality, a certain other being looked at. But so what is the promise of looking? I guess is what my question is. What is the promise of looking? And the promise is to find some sort of connection with the other in a process of identification, and then hopefully recognition of oneself, recognition of the other as oneself. So obviously cinema is not unique, nor is it even the most emblematic example of artistic representation that tries to accomplish this. So visual art I think, has been instrumental in providing humans with meaning about mountains since at least the Romantic period in the early 19th century, with German artists at the forefront of this movement to represent mountains as mystical yet dangerous, a space of solitude and self-reflection for the civilized individual, right? Yet a space inhabited by so-called noble savages, right? And I think, I want to share my screen here. Let's see if this works. Okay, great. So present. So the first thing that really comes to mind when we're thinking about visual representations of mountains and meanings is Caspar David Friedrich's famous painting from 1818 called Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. It's one of the most notable of Romanticist representations of mountains. It sort of defined the genre. And I'll get back to this in a second, but I want to sort of come back to the United States here because I think this genre really matured with the work of mid-century German-American painter Albert Bierstadt. And here are a few of his paintings of mountains from the American West. I guess moving closer to Ukraine, we have Józef Korzeniowski working in Austria and Poland in the 1830s and 1840s, brought the mountain theme to the Slavic world with his romantic play, The Carpathian Highlanders. This is a painting from much later in the 19th century, but sort of, demonstrates that in sort of Polish and Ukrainian paintings or visual representations of the Carpathians, we always have people represented very, very prominently, especially with the, Carpathophilia in many ways is grounded in the relationship between people with landscape, what I call in my book the ethnoscape of the Carpathians. So I know that Patrice Dabrowski has already spoken to you about these issues, so I'll spare you any more repetition with my own talk that draws from sort of literary representations. But what I think is key to understanding this work's relationship to the cinema is how it is essentially teaching us to be spectators, teaching us not only how to see, but maybe even more importantly, what's worth seeing. And I'm often drawn to this English historian of England, that is to say, Keith Thomas, who argued in a famous book from the 1990s that mountains were actually once ugly for Europeans to look at. And they were understood as simply uncivilized. So look at Friedrich's Wander again, because it's so early in the transformation of mountains and meaning. The subject in this painting is not the mountains. It's the gentleman spectator, which tells us that we too should look at these dangerous and ugly stone formations and find meaning out of them, much as if we can interpret this gentleman doing in this painting. So in the 20th century, mountains become democratized in their ability to convey meaning, opening up this space to the urban masses. After all, I love this idea of this seminar connecting the city with the mountains, right? And so I think that's what happens in this sort of theme of visual culture, theme of mountains within visual culture. It serves to kind of open up the space to the urban masses for adventure, for travel, for tourism. But Western modernity also promoted the idea of untainted nature and sort of new age understandings of mountains that have to do with healing, with introspection, with sort of promoting civilization in this distinctly what we might call anti-civilized space, not necessarily uncivilized, but anti-civilized. So capitalism, nationalism, more recently the movement of deep ecology simultaneously produced a mountain that is an exceptional eco-space, a space that is at once emblematic of, but also distinct from the nation more generally. So, but similar to this what we see here, this kind of earlier representation and more modern notions of mountains and meaning is the idea of a space separate from civilization. A space mysterious and unknown. The mountain, as I said, as a kind of anti-civilization that can be read, I think, in two ways, but it's read in these two ways often simultaneous with each other. First of all, as both pure and authentic, right? But also as uncivilized and dangerous. So how does this kind of dialectic of mountains work out in more contemporary visual culture? And here I want to move, very quickly to, I guess one of the first iconic mountains in Ukrainian cinema, I think, is arguably Alexander Dovzhenko's Zvenye Hora from 1927, which presents a mountain that contains mysterious riches, the location of which a group in the first scene of Haidamaki attempt to discover from this old man that we see in the still on the screen. So Zvenye Hora stands in for Ukraine itself, arguably, and the old man functions as a kind of repository of knowledge about the land while also being an isolated and gullible eccentric, right? The film is famously difficult to comprehend, not only in terms of the plot, but also the sort of contradictory meanings contained in the central symbol of the mountain. The scheming Haidamaki, the amoral nationalists, pursue the overdetermined treasure, while the social hero, Timish, could care less about Zvenye Hora. In this way, Dovzhenko's nationalist ecology confronts what I call his teleological humanism. And because of this confrontation between nationalist ecology and teleological humanism, Soviet authorities were, to put it nicely, unimpressed with the result. Now, a decade later, the mountain doesn't really maintain much of a presence in the film, to be honest. It appears like twice, in fact, but it's interesting that this becomes the title of the film. Now, decade later, sorry about the fuzzy image here, it's taken from YouTube, but so in 1939, Dovzhenko was one of the first Ukrainian filmmakers to actually travel to the newly annexed Carpathian territories to make his documentary Bukovina Zemlya Ukrainska. And the film opens with a kind of traditional establishing shot of mountain valleys before cutting to peasants sowing grain. A narrator discusses this joyful yet sorrowful nature of the Bukovinian peasants. The camera pausing on this young man here. And the narrator said, "Here is an illiterate and ignorant young man. Bezgramotny chomny pare." Yet this is also a land, the narrator tells us, that poets call paradise. So more images of mountain vistas, sheep, finally the sound, of course, of the trembita, with the narrator returning us to the primitive ethnoscape of the mountains, a society whose foundation, we are told, is related to honor and blood. So in Dovzhenko's history lesson that he gives us, the Carpathians become a site of brutal massacres of the Hutsuls at the hands of their oppressors, going all the way back to the Mongols, then the Austrians, the Poles, and then most recently, the worst of them all, of course, the oppressive Romanians. And so this mountain paradise had become, as the narrator tells us, a hell. But literally, it's an underworld, the Prispodnaya of Europe. Prispodnaya Европы. So throughout these early scenes of Bukovina Zemlya Ukrainska, the diagonal landscape of the mountain is associated with oppression. When the Red Army arrives, however, liberation occurs on a horizontal landscape. The peasants largely shed their Highlander dress for generically Soviet peasant clothing. Loggers now work efficiently to fell trees, which are then made into boards and plywood at a factory in Chernivtsi. Dovzhenko soon forgets about the mountain itself, and once again, like in Zvenye Hora, in favor of a cultural ethnography of the Hutsuls, now freed from their oppression and able to perform their folk arts and crafts while being educated and lifted out of poverty, largely from Eastern Ukrainians and Russians who have sort of come into this territory and served as liberators. So Dovzhenko had abandoned his nationalist ecology, largely to stay alive, arguably, a compromise that allowed him to make another film about Ukraine, albeit, he's already in exile in Moscow by this time. He's mostly working during the time that he's collecting this material. He's largely working on shores. But I think it's worth dwelling on the transition that happens in this film. You can see it on YouTube. I have some other clips that I want to show of other films, but check it out. It's a poor copy, but you can see what he's doing here if you're interested. So at the beginning of the film, the peasants of Bukovina are oppressed by not only the Romanians, but also by the landscape itself. Dovzhenko invites us to look at these people. Right, we are the lookers. We are invited to be the spectators looking at these miserable people. But by the end, they have overcome their ecological subjugation, and he no longer commands us to look at them. They are no longer subject to our spectatorial gaze. So Dovzhenko's teleological humanism, based equally on conviction and compromise, contrasted sharply with the nationalist ecology of German filmmakers working on mountain thematics during the 1930s too. And so I want to move to this second topic, the second sort of big theme that I think is shown in its proper light, contrasted with Dovzhenko's Bukovina Zemlya Ukrainska. This what's called the German Berg film, or the mountain film, which began, this genre sort of emerged in the mid to late 1920s, sort of on the, to use a mountain metaphor, as it were, on the creative precipice of late Weimar Germany and early National Socialism. This Berg film took its cue from the German Romantic tradition, right? Which, kind of stands at the origins of mountain thematics more generally, I would argue. So mountains became meaningful because they highlight the collision of an authentic Gemeinschaft, or, rooted community, with the mapping and defining powers of the rational individual. Again, an individual from the city who is employing the tools of modern technology. So this is very much a genre of looking and being looked at. The infamous director Leni Riefenstahl's emblematic film Das Blaue Licht, The Blue Light, which came out in 1932, I think is the best example of this nationalist ecology, because it transforms exterior landscapes into emotional spaces, something that we've already seen in Friedrich's Wander. Just go back quickly here. And Riefenstahl's film concerns a young woman, Junta, who has been cast out of her native village for being a witch. She resides in a mountain cave that emits a blue light during the full moon, which supposedly lures local young men from the village to seek out its source, only to die in the climb to get there. So one day, our hero, which of course is a landscape painter, comes from the city to the village where he hears of Junta. So he meets her, he falls in love with her natural beauty, despite the fact they speak different languages. She speaks Italian, right? He speaks German. So one full moon night, he follows her in secret to the source of the blue light, where he finds her among these crystals that produce this mystical aura. So the painter rushes to tell the villagers of the treasures that exist in their midst. They proceed to steal them when Junta is away. After realizing what has happened, she falls to her death. In grief, right? Although it's unclear if she commits suicide or if, she just loses control. a scene, reminiscent, I think, of Marichka's death in Tini Zabutych Predkiv. So after realizing what has happened, okay, so she falls to her death. The painter, meanwhile, he functions as a common tourist. He's bringing modernity to the isolated mountain village through his discovery of the crystals. Moreover, the film is mediated through this painter's views of the exotic space. He's the one teaching us, to reiterate a point I made earlier, he's the one teaching us how to look, why we should look at the mountains. And the imagery is straight from 19th century painting with its cliff faces, mountain valleys shrouded in mist. And, in her famous essay about Leni Riefenstahl, pictured on the left here, called Fascinating Fascism, the American cultural critic Susan Sontag, on the right here, argued that Riefenstahl's mountain aesthetics were part and parcel with her more explicitly Nazi films like Triumph of the Will. Sontag's notion of a fascist aesthetic reads ideal political power as a quote unquote natural phenomenon, unhindered by civilization. So as she defined it, Sontag defined it, fascist aesthetics involve turning people into things, the grouping of people and things around an all-powerful hypnotic force. So while I think that Sontag understood the problem of mountains and meaning all too well, she nonetheless diagnosed all too common symptoms as a disease that was much too specific. Thus, my point in highlighting the Bergfilme in Weimar early Nazi Germany, in some ways, is not a kind of guilty by association jibe, but to show how fluid these ideas of national or nationalist ecology are across time and space. So one, just to bring us back actually to Ukrainian cinema, where we left off a few minutes ago, one small example of what I'm trying to talk about here is Viktor Ivanov's film from 1959 about 17th century Aprishok, Oleksa Dovbusha, generically, stylistically, and narratively conventional picture for Soviet cinema. But here the mountains define the man. They have clear agency. For example, when Oleksa is recruiting rebels to fight the Polish Szlachta, he challenges his recruits to walk across a mountain gulch on a felled tree between two peaks, as if to allow the mountains themselves to decide who is worthy to join him. Moreover, the mountain also functions as a kind of sacred space. Dovbush's men, for example, carry his dying body into the mountains, and instead of a burial, the social hero in this film disappears into the landscape, as if to suggest the mountain's divine presence whisked him away in a whirlwind, much like the biblical prophet Elijah. Ivanov's Dovbush was a mainstream success in 1959, probably much more so than any of the other films that I'm talking about today. More properly, I think the film functioned as Soviet spectators' introduction to the significance of the Ukrainian Carpathians. And it's worth bearing in mind that while Ukrainian artists and writers living under the Habsburgs, living under the Poles, had long understood the significance of the Carpathians for national identity, few Eastern Ukrainians, aside from Mikhail Kostyubinsky, of course, had thought very much about them. So as I've mentioned, and as I've written about, the idea of the Carpathians enters a different stylistic and narrative field during the 1960s, and Ukrainian cinema about the mountains leaves the mainstream and enters an artistic niche that we, of course, know of as Ukrainian poetic cinema. So I find this link to the German Bergfilme significant, not for the association of the genre with the supposedly fascist aesthetic, as Sontag put it, but for Alpine imagery's fundamentally modernist claim to a kind of transcendence of worldly concerns. And by that, we mean the market, politics, the city, right? So as Kostyubinsky himself established in Tini Zabutych Predkiev, a profound, which I think is a profound work of nationalist ecology. The highlands were a space of direct communion with artistic inspiration, whereas the lowlands were associated with the mundane cycle of production and reproduction. Yet both the Bergfilm and Sergei Parajanov's film that was grounded in Kostyubinsky's nationalist ecology assumes a market for objects associated with this transcendent space. Parajanov famously, stole or was gifted objects of Hutsul material culture, which he later got in trouble for. But underneath the surface of this enclosed ecology of the mountains in a film like Tini Zabutych Predkiev is this kind of implicit market. I don't actually want to say anything more about Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors or even Ukrainian poetic cinema, largely because I feel that this dialectics of mountains and meanings is fairly self-evident in much of that work. Instead, what I want to do with the rest of this talk is situate this search for mountains and meaning within mainstream Soviet Ukrainian cinema at the end of the 1960s, but also to contextualize this work within a broader popular cultural fascination with mountain tourism in the USSR at the very end of my talk. So anyway, I chose two unexpected films to focus on here because I think they represent precisely that, the mainstreaming of this fascination with the Carpathians in Soviet Ukraine during the 1960s, away from the project of Ukrainian poetic cinema. So first we have Timofii Levchuk's, I'm gonna stop share for a moment and just sort of talk to you without the PowerPoint. So first we have Timofii Levchuk's Pomylka Onere de Balzaka, the mistake of Onere de Balzac, about the 19th century French writer's visit to Western Ukraine, purely fictional representation of this visit to kindle his love affair with Polish noblewoman Ewelina Hanska. And then second, Boris Ivchenko's Annychka, a film set in Bukovina during the German occupation of World War II, which imagines another love affair, this one between an injured Russian partisan and the daughter of a reluctant collaborator. So both of these films were made by highly connected and powerful people in the Kyiv cultural establishment. Levchuk was, of course, the secretary of the Ukrainian Cinematographers Union. He made, I didn't count exactly, but I think he made more films than any other director during this period, most of which commanded incredibly large budgets, but very few actual moviegoers. I mean, one exception would be Dva Года над пропастью about Ivan Kudry, which was a kind of genre-based adventure film, spy drama, which was very exciting to watch. But in general, he was someone who got lots of money, but very few actual fans, as it were. But a very powerful individual. He cast his daughter in some of his roles. His son-in-law was Grigory Kokhan, a very, very important Kiev-based filmmaker in his own right. Sort of controversial figure in many ways. Anyway, and Ivchenko was the son of Viktor Ivchenko, one of the most popular mainstream Ukrainian directors in the 1950s and early 1960s, the founder of the cinema department at Kyiv Theatrical Institute and the original organizer of the Molodist Film Festival. So Viktor Ivchenko is probably most remembered as the one who discovered Ivan Nikolaichuk. So Ivchenko Sr., that is Viktor, had originally developed Annychka as his own project. He actually co-authored the screenplay, decided in the end to offer the project to his son who had just graduated from the film school that he ran in Kyiv. So Levchuk's initial, we'll put that aside for now, but Levchuk's initial foray into Carpathian imagery occurred very briefly in his probably, unfortunately, best remembered, not necessarily for any necessarily good reasons, but best remembered film was, the best remembered film was his sort of literary biopic about Ivan Franko from 1956. It was made at a time when most Ukrainian films were shot inside Kiev Film Studio, now Ivchenko Film Studio. But included in this is a very short scene at the beginning of the film that involves this kind of brief interlude where, the title character floats down the Cherimosh on a log raft, after which he dances with the Hutzels and finally enjoys a brief moment of solitude in the mountains for poetic inspiration. More generally, however, Levchuk's Ivan Franko bears the aesthetics of late Stalinism in its slow pacing. It's lots of talking. There's an incredible amount of talking. It's kind of late Stalinist aesthetic and a generally artificial studio sound that contrasted with the kind of ethnographic character of the scene mentioned above. Now, after spending most of the 1960s opposed to or simply confused by the representational politics of the thaw, Levchuk fought hard for his quote unquote Balzac in Ukraine project, this long dreamed of intent to adapt Nathan Rybak's 1940 novel about the French writer's journey to the Russian Empire in the late 1840s. Originally, Levchuk intended the film to follow on the heels of his Ivan Franko biopic, done in the same sort of traditional style for Soviet literary biopics, with the occasional local color thrown in, as I just talked about. The project was abandoned in the late 50s for reasons that remain unclear, but perhaps there was a dispute with the powerful Russian screenwriter Mikhail Bleman, who felt that Rybak had stolen his own story about Balzac in St. Petersburg. So in the intervening years, Levchuk continued to develop the screenplay with Rybak and another studio editor named Grigory Zadovich, who drew out the novel's admittedly brief scene in Western Ukraine. So early drafts of the screenplay provoked complaints that these scenes were merely decorative. And this is important sort of critique that sort of plagues a lot of kind of ethnographically focused films about Ukraine. So they're merely decorative. Why is decorative? Where's the narrative? It lacked narrative motivation. So in other words, they didn't seem to have a point, these scenes in Ukraine. So Levchuk attempted to assuage these criticisms by introducing a revised screenplay with the claim that, quote, the film permits a spontaneous and deep revelation of the image of life of our people. So in comparison to the novel, the screenplay has significantly expanded Balzac's acquaintance with the Ukrainian people, not only in Kyiv, but also in Verkhyvnya, where the Hanska, where Evelina Hanska's land is. This is sort of in Zhytomyr Oblast, sort of near the Vinnytsia border, if you can imagine where that is. So the narrative motivation for the famous writer is, I think, but a weak device in this film to establish the fictional connection between Balzac and Ukraine. At once a kind of celebrity association written upon the entire nation and a view of that nation read through the eyes of a famous tourist. I don't want to delve too far into the plot because I don't see it as key to the point I'm making about it. In fact, the plot is fairly boring. This is not a good film. This is really a second-rate film from the late 60s in comparison with the best that even other Ukrainians were making at this time. So I want to focus instead on the border crossing between the Austrian and Russian empires, which happens about 10 minutes into the film. Balzac is in his carriage at the time, and he you know, he's passing through the Eastern Carpathians on the Austrian side of the border as he sort of remembers his last encounter with Hanska, with his love. And the iconic, we see these iconic scenes of sheep, distant mountains are shown through Balzac's carriage window, offering viewers a subjective and mediated view of the scene that's in stark contrast to the stuffy and traditional cinematography in most of this film. So the combination of a POV shot cross-cut with Balzac looking through the window consistently serving as a visual metaphor for a movie screen in this film, places spectators in the position of an outsider moving across a foreign border. So here Levchuk represents the politically constructed border as a physical barrier between the familiar and the unfamiliar. And interestingly, this entire scene on the road is absent from the screenplay, including the director's script that Zeldovich prepared for him. So as the Carpathians sort of recede into the foothills and into the steppe, the writer passes through customs into the Russian Empire. Then three men in Keptari greet the writer, one of them being the writer's French translator, Leon, or Levko, as he's sometimes called, played by none other than Ivan Mikolaichuk. And so let me share my screen here once again. And I want to show some of this scene. Let's move back a little bit. Okay, so
Господин Бальзак, поздравляю вас с благополучным прибытием на таможенный пункт Российской империи.
Благодарю вас.
Экипаж ее светлости графини Ганской ждет вас.
Благодарю вас.
Я, ваша милость.
А, тот самый Леон, который владеет французским языком, знает наизусть басни Ле Фонтена, читал мои книги.
Евгению Гранде, ваша милость.
О,
На здоровье.
а Сент-Белла знаешь?
Этого господина я не знаю.
И не надо знать.
Будьте здоровы.
Второй месяц копаете наши земли.
okay, I think that's enough to get the point here. So again, I'm not making any claim that this is a good film. Nonetheless, Levchuk made some interesting decisions that diverted from the director's script. First of all, the screenplay identifies Radzivilov as the border crossing, which is not the landscape that we actually see in this scene. And second, the scene of singing is completely absent in the script, as only Leon himself stands ready to serve as master as he crosses the border. Finally, I would say giving this role to Mikolaichuk sharply heightened the importance of this supporting character within the film as a whole, a very minor character in the director's script, and implicitly referenced the Carpathians despite their narrative and geographic absence on the Russian side of the border. So in the screenplay, Rybak and Zeldovich imagined a quote unquote typical Ukrainian landscape. And there was a scene that they wrote where Balzac passes by a well as a crane lands next to a dangling wooden bucket. So this is the visual cue that the screenwriters envisioned to signal Ukraine to audiences, which was supposed to be shot, interestingly enough, at Askania Nova in Kherson. But owing to the representational politics of the 1960s, this image of the Ukrainian landscape suddenly became a more diversified topography that was ethnographically coded as Bukovina, owing to the kind of style of the cinematography and the presence of these three apparent Hutzels in a completely different part of Ukraine. So shortly after the scene, we cut to a wide-angle view of an empty valley with only the figure of Balzac in the frame, looking very similar to Friedrich's Wanderer or Riefenstahl's star-crossed landscape painter. So in voiceover, Balzac calls Ukraine a, quote, mysterious and unknown land, right? Ukraine becomes kind of subservient to this discourse of mountains more generally. So Balzac gathers Ukrainian dirt into his hands, pressing it against his face with pleasure. And in this way, the film constantly forces its hero to recognize the beauty of Ukraine's landscape, its people, its history, which remains unmotivated in the narrative and furthermore absent in the screenplay from which Levchuk adapted this film. Okay, so I don't want to take up too much more time, so I want to quickly move to the second film that I want to draw out here. It's Ivchenko's Annychka, also from 1968. Its location within the canon, I think, is more established. First, because Ivchenko went on to make a definitive classic of Ukrainian cinema in 1972, Propala Hramota, and because Annychka is actually located in Bukovina, with filming taking place in Verkhovina, which with many of the same sets that Tini Zabutych Predkiev employed by Perezhanov. Finally, Mikolajchuk occupies a more central space in this film, playing a psychologically complex character who attempts to reconcile his love of Ukraine with collaboration with the German occupiers. Now, most significantly, this film presents one of the best efforts at Soviet reconciliation with Ukrainian nationalism, largely because it deflects these political problems into a melodramatic frame. So at the same time, Annychka both conformed to the accepted devices of socialist realism, the World War II film, first and foremost as a mainstream film. Annychka begins with the camera panning across a mountain vista with the sound of an intense storm. The image is dark, it's impenetrable, it's romantically mysterious, as fits the sort of discourse of mountains and meaning. Let me just quickly show that film.
What are you doing on your phone? I'm sorry, I left a gentleman.
Sorry about the ad. I'll start it after that. Let me share my screen again. So what I'm saying here is this is, your typical opening to any film about the Carpathians, that with the notable exception of Tini Zabutych Predkiev itself, which begins with the close-up shot of our hero. But this, I showcase this beginning simply because of its generic sort of is so generically banal. But I think that unlike the other films that I've talked about here, Annychka's texture is clear. It's imparting the image with the quality of lived-in space rather than a mythic space. So let me watch what happens after this opening scene. My point is simply that in this, the film switches to a rather unremarkable scene grounded in a kind of realist cinematography. Okay, so and that's a style the film is largely done on. The film involves the title character Annychka finding a wounded partisan. She hides him from her father. She cooks up this scheme where they're going to let him escape, allow him to escape the Germans, and this occurs during a very iconic scene of a Hutzel wedding. That is actually more, kind of realistic than what Parajanov did, a few years earlier. So the plan goes haywire. Dad kills his daughter, and the final image is of the father seen in this shot, in this opening shot. He's also the final image, shocked at what he's done, right? So while ostensibly this is a film about a young woman's rising consciousness, about the bankrupt moral principles of Ukrainian nationalism during the Great Patriotic War, the film nonetheless functions at the level of melodrama for its foregrounding of the domestic realm as the site where quote unquote politics is worked through. So, but even beyond this realm of the family, the Carpathians remains a highly insular political and cultural space where Andrei, the partisan, appears just as foreign as the Nazi occupiers. And like, in Das Blaue Licht, the German film that I talked about earlier, the presence of the outside love interest ultimately brings about the death of the female protagonist, as if to suggest that opening up this space leads to inevitable doom. Thus, the central political conflict of the film is not really partisans versus Nazis, but the uneasy alliance between two enemy ideologies. Enemy in quotes here, in scare quotes, if you can imagine that. Ukrainian nationalism on the one hand, and the German occupation on the other. An alliance fraught with cultural difference and misunderstanding that's grounded in this mysterious place of the mountains. Okay, so I wanted to conclude by moving away from Ukraine once again and look at one more film, the cult classic Vertikal, from 1965, 1966, which ultimately became a vehicle for, Vladimir Vysotsky's musical career. But as a mountain film, Vertikal is very different from what I'm calling this nationalist ecology on display in the previous examples. So the narrative and the imagery that accompany Vertikal is not, so the story really quick is about this group of Russian mountain climbers who go to the Caucasus to sort of conquer this mountain, right? They conquer this mountain, but they run into a storm, a blizzard, an avalanche, and they have to flee for their lives, right? So this narrative, this imagery that accompanies it is not tied into a nationalist ecology like the earlier films, with its focus on the mountain as an object of conquest. It presents us with an imperialist ecology. And I'm out of time here, but I want you to look at the first scene where the credits roll, in which our Russian heroes hike to the village at the base of this peak. At issue here is ethnic difference. These lookers, these tourists are not there for the purpose of recognizing the beauty of the landscape or for any ethnographic reason. Instead, they understand conquest as an end in itself. And in this respect, the mountains function as an angry God who scoffs at human arrogance, in a sense, returning us to this more ancient image of the mountains. The mountain of Sinai, of Jabal Nur, of Taishan, devoid of any sophisticated meaning imparted from either a romanticist or a modernist tradition. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Joshua. Yeah, I am still impressed, kind of trying to achieve everything that I heard. I like very much the way you combine the film studies and then also nationalism, and the historiography with very important issues of the gaze, watching how we construct the gaze, how the culture actually shapes what we see and how we understand reality. That's why I think the title of your presentation was Mountains and Meanings. Yeah, so how we derive meanings from mainly culture. Okay, I'm pleased to announce our commenter. He is not an academic scholar, though Oleg Chorny graduated from Karpenko-Karey Institute of Cinematography, and yet I don't know the official translation into English of the title of the main Ukrainian institution. Oleg Chorny is an active film director, and he has more than 10 films. So his filmography is rather rich, and one of the films, which is called Hollywood Over the Dnieper River, deals specifically with the landscape, the central Ukrainian landscape. And of course, this film is about cinematographic imagination shaped within the Kiev circles. So that's why Dnieper is a kind of the special location near Dnieper River was a kind of Hollywood imagined by the Kiev-based filmmakers as a almost holy, a very cinematographic place to make Ukrainian films. Specifically, what you call this national ecology. It was filled with this national ecology. So I think Oleg knows very well what you're talking about from his personal practice of being a film director and also scholar who prepares for such films. Besides this, also Oleg is preparing for, we hope so, to make a film about Mukachevo in Transcarpathia. This is a recent project, but that's all said. I don't want to add something that might not be in the focus of Oleg talk. So please, Oleg, the floor is yours. Треба розмутити Олега, бо він...
Доброго дня, чи точніше доброго вечора, Богдане. Дякую за таке представлення. Трошечки перебільшене, бо я все ж таки не є науковцем. Вітаю пана Джошуа. Дякую йому за такі дуже цікаву розвідку, за дуже цікаву лекцію. Часом для мене дуже несподівані відкриття і асоціації. І дякую за запрошення до коментаря виступу пана Джошуа, бо деякі названі стрічки, вони є для мене до певної міри, вони мають стосунок і до мого власного життя. Бо почасти я цих людей, які в цих стрічках працювали, або їх робили, знав особисто, або вчився у них, або от мій батько дотичний взагалі до фільму «Анnychka», бо він був співредактором цієї картини. І я особисто знав Віктора Івченка, хоча він помер 72-го, я був ще, я був школярем, початкові класи, але я його знав. Мій тато з ним товаришував. В будинку, де ми мешкаємо, жила його перша дружина, мати Бориса Івченка, і я її добре знав. І знову ж таки моїм вчителем був Костянтин Петрович Степанков, який грав одну з головних ролей в фільмі «Annychka», це батька Аннички. І, до речі, сьогодні у нього день народження, отак от співпало. Сьогодні день народження Костя Петровича Степанкова. І одразу хочу трошечки зараз повернутися до початку виступу пана Джошуа і трошечки вступити з ним в легку суперечку, точніше подати невеличке уточнення щодо Олександра Петровича Довженка. Бо насправді Довженко реально вперше потрапив в Карпати не зі зйомками фільму «Україна на Буковина, земля українська» чи «Буковина там наша радянська», там є дві назви цієї стрічки. Він вперше потрапив в Карпати 39-го року, дійсно, але це була картина визволення. Вони приїхали до Львова фактично за тиждень після того, як туди увійшли радянські війська. А потім вони поїхали знімати в Карпати на Черемош в Жаб'є. І разом з ним теж була Сонцева, а «Буковина, земля українська» – це вже наступний фільм наступного року 40-го. Бо була анексована Буковина в 40-му році, але там теж дуже слизьке питання. Довженко брав участь на початках цих зйомок, а потім, здається, Сонцева знімала сама. Ну, так свідчать документи, бо там відбулася така трошечки історія суто технічна. Вони за першу експедицію в Карпати, коли їздив Довженко, вони зняли брак, там був брак плівки, і вимушені були перезнімати. Одразу додам таку річ, що ця картина «Буковина наша радянська» насправді не вийшла в прокат. Бо почалася війна, вони її не встигли випустити, на відміну, знову ж таки, від «Визволення». Я не знаю, чи пан Джошуа дивився «Визволення», бо це така досить таки рідкісна стрічка. Ще, що я хотів би відмітити, тепер вже повернемося до фільму «Анnychka». Пан Джошуа дуже цікаво відмітив початок цієї картини, оцю панораму по горам, яка є такою, з одного боку, репрезентацією Карпат, з іншого боку, доволі, так би мовити, зараз вже стандартною. Але я хочу звернути увагу на те, що тоді це не було стандартним, бо дійсно «Анnychka», так само, як і «Довбуш» Віктора Іванова, входить в число касових стрічок. Пан Джошуа це, напевно, знає. Вона там за перший рік демонстрації зібрала 25 мільйонів глядачів, «Довбуш» більше трошечки, але це дійсно, це була друга стрічка, яка репрезентувала Карпати фактично для масового глядача. І відверто, звичайно, що ці стрічки в репрезентації для масового глядача, особливо тих, хто ніколи не бачив Карпати, скажімо, як я, як представник Центральної України, я взагалі в Карпати потрапив вперше десь приблизно на початку 80-х. До того я це бачив, знову ж таки, тільки в кіно. А ще раніше образ Карпат доходив до мене через казки. У мене була книжечка вдома, там «Казки Карпат», воно якось так називалося, і ти її відкривав як центральний українець з Центральної України, всі ці казкові слова, Тайстра, Бартка, я не знаю, чи пані Світлана зараз зможе перекласти, там бринза, ще щось. І це було, воно так якось звучало як абсолютно інша мова. І знову ж ці картини, бо «Ніде правди діти», там, скажімо, з точки зору мистецтва, звичайно, «Тіні забутих предків», і дякую пану Джошуа за ці асоціації між жіночими персонажами в «Тінях» чи в «Анничці». Тіні, звичайно, це мистецьке явище, але на загал, для загалу, вони не мали жодного комерційного успіху. Це взагалі дуже смішна історія, я про неї дізнався нещодавно, що у Параджанова є одна дуже касова стрічка. Вона потрапляє в 1000 касових радянських стрічок, але це комедія «Перший хлопець», яка вважається там абсолютно провальним для нього фільмом, але вона мала касовий успіх. «Тіні забутих предків» не мали касового успіху, хоча були таким міжнародним хітом, отримали безліч нагород на фестивалях, тому на якесь сприйняття масового глядача Карпат в Радянському Союзі, я думаю, що їх вплив був мінімальний, так само, як і дійсно ще одного абсолютного шедевра українського кіно – це «Камінного Христа», де Карпати теж повністю репрезентовані, і це все видно, і ще й там екранізація Стефаника До речі, взагалі єдина екранізація Стефаника в повнометражному кіно в українському. Більше ніхто нічого за Стефаником не знімав. Ну, я маю, там була ще одна курсова робота, колись знята за злодієм моїм добрим знайомим. От. І ще хочу відмітити одну таку цікаву штуку, що всі ці творчі колективи, які для українського глядача, звичайно, відкривали на екрані ці Карпати, так само, як і для глядачів всього іншого Радянського Союзу. З цих знімальних груп самих представників, які б натурально репрезентували Карпати, були буквально одиниці. Навіть в тій самій Анничці, там, Миколайчук, там невеликий епізод зіграв видатний актор Василь Симчич, який грав теж у Камінному хресті Осики. І, власне, в усіх цих стрічках це була, можна сказати, така одна і та сама тусовка, одна і та сама група людей, більшість з яких натурально до Карпат, до Західної України ніякого стосунку не мали. Ні Кось Петрович Степанков, ні сам Віктор Івченко, ні Борис Івченко, ні от Анничка знята нашим українським видатним оператором Миколою Кульчицьким, який взагалі знімав першу українську кольорову стрічку «Сорочинський ярмарок». Я його теж знав особисто, мав честь. І оце така дуже дивний аспект, що ці всі візуальні образи, і Параджанов, там, наприклад, якщо подивитися акторський склад в «Тінях забутих предків», там знову ж таки Миколайчук, і хто там ще? Спартак Багашвілі, грузин, Бестаєва, татарка. Це дуже феноменально, бо його цікавили взагалі візуальні образи, і абсолютно вони створювали оцю магію, так само, як він творив, скажімо, в «Тінях забутих предків», вигадував оцей обряд з цим ярмом на весіллі, що не є абсолютно реалістичним, але воно це впливало. Ще хочу сказати два слова про... Я був дуже здивований, пан Джошуа, коли ви обрали фільм, я ще з анонсу, «Помилка Онере де Бальзака». Це мене дуже здивувало, бо дійсно ви маєте рацію. Тимофій Васильович, якого теж знав особисто, і до якого випадково там так сталося, що я заледве не втрапив працювати асистентом в картину. Він був насправді, попри те, що він був, як кажуть, кінематографічним генералом, його так відкрито називали, і дійсно мав більші можливості, очолював спілку кінематографістів, був депутатом Верховної Ради України, взагалі мав там всі можливі регалії, народний артист СССР. Він був насправді дуже доброю людиною, допомагав своїм студентам. І дійсно «Помилка Онере де Бальзака» – це, ви абсолютно маєте рацію, досить таки посередній фільм, який, проте, там є дуже цікаві речі. Наприклад, він, знову ж таки, знятий видатним оператором Володимиром Войтенко. Він був моїм сусідом, мешкав в сусідньому будинку. Я теж там живу в будинках, де жили кінематографісти. Їх зараз вже майже немає. І щодо репрезентації Карпат, там насправді дуже цікаво, бо зрозуміло, що всю цю картину Левчук знімав там в Україні, і в СССР, так. І тут Карпати, зняті вже в Україні, репрезентували Карпати закордонні. Так само, як там Париж, знятий частково у Львові. Бо я там, наприклад, пізнав цей знаменитий кадр, де на розі вулиць Драгоманова і Грушевського оця церква, яка треба зібрати просто галерею фільмів, де вона грає там Париж, Відень. Я вже за останній час там переглядав кілька стрічок. І цікавий дуже аспект, знову ж таки заявлений в анонсі вашої лекції, пане Джошуа, що от такі гір і смисл. От для мене зараз фільм «Помилка Онере де Бальзака», попри його посередність, дійсно, ви тут маєте рацію, раптом відкрила один абсолютно незвичний смисл. По-перше, я його дивився 30 років тому, одразу зізнаюся. І якби не запрошення взяти участь, коментувати ваш виступ, я, можливо, б його і не передивлявся. Да. І там раптом звучить щонайменше тричі протягом картини прізвище Кюстіна, Астольфа де Кюстіна. Тобто і Бальзака весь час схиляють написати щось хвалебне, на відміну від того, що зробив Кюстін. І зараз для мене це було абсолютне відкриття, хоча там зрозуміло, бо Астольфа де Кюстіна в Радянському Союзі не видавали. Він був виданий, здається, одного разу 29-го року. Ну, він же ж сварить Російську імперію. Видання дуже швидко розійшлося, а потім раптом на горі в Москві зрозуміли, що там надто багато асоціацій з Радянським Союзом. І те, що прізвище Кюстіна щонайменше тричі в картині обговорюється, і це для мене було абсолютним відкриттям зараз, знаєте, таким несподіваним. Ну, і що ще я б хотів сказати, от цікаво дуже, що ви долучили фільм «Вертикаль» до цього списку. Дійсно, це, знову ж таки, один з касових хітів, ви правильно говорите, їх там подивилися, здається, протягом року 30 000. І, знову ж таки, для мене цей фільм теж має особисту приватну історію, бо я спершу почув пісні Висоцького, записані на магнітофон з цього фільму, а стрічку подивився набагато пізніше, випадково по телебаченню. І знову ж таки, одна з актрис, яка грає в цьому фільмі, Маргарита Кошелєва, вона грає ту Риту, яка йде з хлопцями в гори, Висоцький з Ларисою Лужиною залишається внизу. Там, до речі, цікава деталь, що там в картині всі персонажі названі ім'ями акторів, ну, справжніми. Тобто Маргарита Миколаївна, вона Рита, Висоцький він Володя, Саша він Саша, тут це дуже цікава деталь. І Маргариту Миколаївну я теж знав особисто, бо вона була дружиною нашого одного дуже хорошого кінорежисера Артура Войтецького, а я працював в інституті з його сином. І бував вдома, і вона там, ну, вона згадувала цю картину, звичайно. Зрозуміло, що ця картина для неї була важлива. І хотів би до ваших слів уточнити, що там дійсно ви маєте рацію, що вона спрацювала на кар'єру Висоцького, але вона спрацювала трошечки дивним чином, вона його легалізувала. Висоцький був вже відомий. Він вже, якраз це був той період 60-ті роки, коли з'явилися магнітофони, записи, вже люди переписували про Висоцького, я згадую, навіть в 70-ті роки ходили оці неймовірні легенди, які розповідали, що він сидів в тюрмі, і обов'язково там фігурувала якась історія, коли хтось комусь сказав, я це чув особисто, що у нього є знайомий, який відсидів термін в тюрмі, а його друг сидів в тюрмі з Висоцьким, і там, значить, в тому бараку, де розміщувалися ці зеки, вони дуже оберігали ту койку, де лежав Висоцький, і тільки якийсь бугор міг на цій койці спати, тобто це привілей. І тут дійсно особливість Висоцького як поета і як актора, бо це був сплав, він не був просто поетом, і він в кожній пісні фактично розігрував якусь біографію, якийсь етюд, і тому всі вірили, що він там зек, водій, майор, там, anyway, да. От, і це ж дійсно, що після цієї картини, за рік після того, нарешті у нього вийшла перша платівка з цими піснями. І от тоді дійсно його легалізували, хоча там і надалі були проблеми. Там була ціла історія, як вони пробивали цю, щоб він записав пісні, не дозволяли. І знову ж таки, я зараз, дякуючи вам, передивився цю картину 30 років по тому і помітив одну річ, яку я тоді не міг бачити, що там взагалі музичний ряд картини, він зроблений ще видатною композиторкою Софією Губайдуліною. Вона зробила аранжування цих пісень Висоцького, додала там оці звуки, труби в пісні «Вершина», зробила взагалі музику до інших епізодів. Ну, власне, це радянська авангардистка на рівні Шнітке, Едісона Денісова чи Арве Пярта. Я цього там, ну, тоді чи не звертав увагу, чи не знав. І це теж така, знову для мене цей фільм отримав новий смисл завдяки запрошенню, завдяки вашій лекції. Ну і взагалі я хочу там ще додати, що насправді ж перші спроби для радянських глядачів і для глядачів іншої частини України на Західної, вони відбулися трошечки раніше, 56-57 рік. Це там були такі фільми, там 54-й навіть, «Земля за Кобилянською», де там Бучма був, Буковина, а потім над Черемошем був фільм про колективізацію і ще фільм «Долина синіх скель». Ну, це такі фільми, які там були ясно, що сильно заідеологізовані. І ось дійсно Лекса Довбуш Іванова, бо це пригодницька стичка, опришки, спротив, і Анничка, яка фактично є за жанром мелодрама, бо тут є усі складові. Вони дійсно відкрили от, візуальний образ цих Карпат, але знову ж таки по парадоксу в 60-ті роки більше для образу Карпат спрацювала російська картина «Трембіта», яка там протягом року зібрала, ну я не знаю, чи пан Джошуа її, мабуть, не бачив, 50 мільйонів, і потім її дивились, крутили по телевізору, де всі росіяни грали гуцулів, і там був тільки один український актор Борис Савченко, який потім став режисером. Він, до речі, того ж року він знімався в «Камінному хресті» у Васики, що й у «Трембіти». Я Бориса Івановича теж знаю особисто. Ну, я зараз не буду затягувати, бо говорити про це все можна дуже довго, багато, бо це для мене приватні історії, і не знаю, наскільки вони можуть бути глядачам, слухачам цікаві. І ще раз пану Джошуа хочу подякувати, і буду зараз детальніше вивчати його книжку, бо я її так почав читати, і ну, це треба більш детально до розгляду. Ну і hope to see you in Kyiv, maybe.
Okay. Thank you, Oleg. Thank you. Joshua, you made a Ukrainian film director to watch again films about Carpathians, which I think is beautiful story.
I think that turned out generally pretty good, although pretty sorry in some ways.
I also recognized in the titles of this entrance scene from Annychka that like remuneration of various actors and then institutions involved in this film, and then there was subscription that people from the town of Verkhovina, and it's interesting that they changed this village in village Jabie into Verkhovina, and then in imagination of editors from Ivchenko Studios, Verkhovina became a town, which is not true and never was true, but it also shows this urban-rural kind of small connection. But yeah, you have time to react on these comments of Oleg, please.
Just really quick here. Thank you so much, Oleg. There's really wonderful recollections. And I just want to respond to one thing you said about the Marquis de Custine in The Mistake of Onere de Balzac. And what's interesting about this is, first of all, Custine actually appears in the novel. Okay, so this is 1940, right? There's a little bit of a, you know, a mini thaw of 1940. And Rybak's novel includes Custine as a character who was friends with Balzac, which is also not true, I don't think. And in the screenplay, Balzac was still supposed to be a character. And so, yeah, it's interesting that he's mentioned, but he was taken out as a character. because the novel is much more concerned with the culture of Petersburg. Like, how does this Frenchman, encounter St. Petersburg society and politics, right? Whereas, Hanska is just like, well, that's kind of off in the provinces, right? But the main thrust of the novel is in St. Petersburg. And so clearly the Custine and this imagined relationship with the Custine is going to be a lot more important in that framework. But as you erase that framework from Levchuk's film, the Custine becomes merely a reference point rather than a fully fleshed out character. I don't know. I welcome other questions.
We are very happy since the audience is global. We have a comment from Javier Ayala from Ecuador, who greets us and says, excellent, congratulations for the interesting lecture. So we have people from various places listening and watching this event. There is actually there is a question which was for many probably not clear, and you have possibility to clear this out again. This connection between Sonntag and then the fascist film, and then how it is related to this nationalist ecology or Carpathian film. So please, if you can again kind of enumerate or clear it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like part of a much larger debate about what, Susan Sontag sort of introduced this idea of the fascist aesthetic, right? And she was primarily looking at Leni Riefenstahl as a director of Nazi documentaries such as Triumph of the Will, which is about the 1933 Nuremberg Party rally, universally associated with, the Third Reich, right? This is the global image of Hitler. This is the global image of the goose-stepping SS, stormtrooper, et cetera, et cetera. And, this image was constructed not in reality, not by the party itself, but by Leni Riefenstahl as a film director, as a very skilled film director. And then she went on to make, the almost equally famous Olympiad about the 1936 Berlin Olympics, which also kind of celebrated male bodies, celebrated kind of the kind of primordial culture that was on display in the classical culture, the classical Greco-Roman culture that was on display, that was also being constructed in this in the Olympiad. And so what she does is say is dispute this idea that there is a sort of pre-fascist Leni Riefenstahl and a post-fascist Leni Riefenstahl, and to sort of incorporate the Berg film, because she either appears as an actress in a lot of these films, or she begins to make her own, beginning with Das Blaue Licht. And so this is part of the fascist aesthetic because it celebrates the same sort of features of human bodies, of primordial forces, and this ultimately, Sontag argues, is the kind of feeling, is the kind of emotional territory that is where we find a support for National Socialism. So that's the idea of the Third Reich, of the fascist aesthetic. And ultimately, she was trying to move even beyond that we can find elements of the fascist aesthetic in outside of Germany, elsewhere within global culture, and in particular within the representation of the mountain as this mysterious and primordial space. And so what I'm saying is that I don't think she had this right. I think calling it a fascist aesthetic is much too specific, and it leads us down a path of simply condemning anything that more or less looks like what Riefenstahl was doing. It's a kind of, as I put it, it's a guilty by association perspective that I think is unfair to the films that I was talking about, and maybe even unfair to Riefenstahl. Although I'm a little on the fence on her. She's a complex figure. I watched a documentary about her several years ago, and I sort of enjoy her work tremendously. Not trying for the will, but a lot of her non-Nazi work it's pretty good. And Das Blaue Licht is a pretty amazing film, and I actually suggest that you guys watch it. But calling this fascist just discounts it out of hand and takes us away from considering it any deeper than that. And so in my term, the sort of, I think it's my term, I haven't encountered it elsewhere, this nationalist ecology, I think gives this work a little bit more credit for what it's trying to accomplish while remaining at the same time critically distant from it. Does that answer the question, Asya?
Yeah, at least it's clear that, you are more like criticizing something than just referring. And there is no, of course, direct connection. But yes, landscape can play a powerful role in visual arts, and this visual metonymy or visual metaphors can work for various ideological purposes. And of course, if it's needed, then it can be employed. My question, if I may, and also to the audience, if you have a question, please use the reaction bar in the lower bar of Zoom, and you can raise your hand, and I see all those who raise the hand, and then I can give the possibility to ask direct question. And the same is for people watching this event on YouTube. You can write your questions on the YouTube chat, and our colleagues will transfer these questions here to our Zoom let's say studio, virtual studio. So if I may, I will start also asking questions about these, let's say, like this national and transnational imagery. You mentioned the last your example. You said that it's more like imperial or other way of seeing the mountains. Yes. But then, taking into account what Oleg said about the Ukrainian poetic cinema, none of these people were local, except probably Mykolaichuk. Yes. So, how, in general, what is your take on this? How we can interpret the poetic cinema? Is this a nationalist or rather also kind of imperial view on these localities, on these landscapes, on the Carpathians? Is this internal colonization? What kind of colonial view we have, since we don't have locals seeing locals? Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really difficult question. I mean, I have a fondness for almost all of these people that I write about. And so I find it really hard to call them colonialists, right? I think that, I have a much easier time calling someone like Stanislav Govorukhin an imperialist, because he freaking was, I mean, the guy was a bad dude. And he made Vertikal. I mean, he was friends with Vysotsky, and that's great. But the guy is an awful man. And I think he deserves that critique. But like, I have an incredible amount of sympathy for Ivchenko, for Parajanov, for Ivchenko, even though Ivchenko is a controversial figure. And I think that not everything he did or said is worthy of is commendable. But I think his desire to look at the Carpathians, to sort of make meaning out of this what had been a foreign space, as Oleg pointed out, was born out by a love of his country, and it wasn't about exclusion; it was about inclusion, at least at that point. And even if it involved a little bit of appropriation, which which I think is sort of related to this kind of colonial aesthetic that you're referring to, Bohdan. I don't think that's the dominant thrust. So again, I would only say that we can critique certain aspects of that kind of that colonial vision, that politics of the gaze. I think we would be ill-served to condemn it. That's about as good as I can do to really answer your question.
Okay, thank you, Josh. We have also questions from...
One more point,
Yep.
sorry,
Yeah.
one more point
Okay.
that I want to make, and that is they were very interested. I mean, they always mention, you always see at the very beginning, we use locals in making this film. You know, we brought in extras, we celebrated this architecture, you know, we in a certain way attempted to preserve this territory. And that's, you know, maybe that's a more important comment than this sort of colonizing gaze that was also present, but also, you know, understated. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, it may be also the socialist approach to show and involve locals, which was normal through all the Soviet Ukrainian history. Locals had to be prominently represented. I see raising hand by Alexei Isakov, and then Oleg Chorny also has some other comment, but then we will start from Alexei and then to Oleg.
Мені здається, що пан Олег був перший, то я би залюбки надав йому першим слово.
Олегу, вам слово, прошу. You can unmute yourself, or we can unmute you technically. Зараз. Oleg is talking to his phone, so it's a complicated matter.
Хотів би доповнити трошечки пана Джоша, бо він сказав дуже цікаву думку про намагання освоїти. І дійсно, це приїжджає тут, скажімо, для Параджанова, це почасти було близьке, бо він теж людина гір. Для всіх інших, там для Івченка, для старшого чи молодшого, чи акторів, знову ж таки, повторюю, за винятком Миколайчука, Симчича, який в Камінному Хресті, там вони теж люди з того регіону, їх там 1, 2, 3 людини, це можна порахувати. Але там є ще один аспект, Богдане, там залучення місцевих жителів, то не є там якесь соціалістичне, як ти кажеш. Це є типове для кінематографа, бо, ну, слухай, потрібна масовка, ти масовку не будеш вести з Києва, да. Ну, це мусить бути місцеві мешканці, тобі треба добудувати декорацію двору, це, ну, треба брати місцевих, і це абсолютно нормальна практика кінематографічна. І є ще один важливий аспект. Перед кінематографістами, які до того могли фільмувати тільки, скажімо, в центральній Україні, ну добре, як в Вертикалі, поїхати на Кавказ. Але раптом відкриваються нові локації, ширші можливості. І бажання освоїти, приїхати туди, ну це просто непереборне кінематографічне бажання, яке дає тобі нові засоби виразності, які диктуватимуть оця локація, оця натура. І ще один важливий аспект, абсолютно пов'язаний з радянським кінематографом. Кінематографісти, які працювали на студії, ну, от ти, приміру, маєш матеріал, і ти змушений знімати в павільйонах. Виключно в павільйонах. І над тобою висить дирекція кіностудії, ти мусиш регулярно показувати відзнятий матеріал, тобі дають більше зауважень, а може це треба перезняти, а тут він сказав якусь таку репліку, ну я зараз трошечки це перебільшую, але можливість виїхати в експедицію якомога далі, від дирекції, це отримати певний момент свободи. Тоді ж не було мобільних телефонів. Тоді вони приїхали там в Жаб'є, а там от 2 телефони, мабуть, є взагалі. Що тобі там дзвонять, телеграми шлють. Мені розказував Михайло Ільєнко про білий птах з чорного знаку, як знімали. Каже, там був один телефон у цього голови сільради, і все. І там мусили дзвонити, слати телеграми, і так, дійсно, все одно треба було відзнятий матеріал на проявку в Київ, і там дирекція його дивилася, але все одно звужується коло того, скільки тобі будуть робити зауважень, і що вони там ще не те побачать, і так будуть змушували перезнімати, дознімати, але все одно ти маєш більше свободи на місці, ніж якби ти знімав на самій студії або в локаціях, які знаходяться ближче до студії, там, скажімо, під Києвом чи навіть там в Черкаській області.
Thank you, Olego. So we have also practical dimension for going up to the mountains, since it was very picturesque and remote from Kyiv, at least. Олексій Ісаков.
Дуже дякую. Thank you, Doctor, first for your very interesting insights and the comparisons that you had. I was also impressed by your perspective of comparing Ukrainian poetic cinema with, for example, with Leni Riefenstahl, who I also know pretty well, but never thought of any parallels between those two. So that was very interesting to hear. І дуже дякую, пані Олеже, за цікавий коментар. I have two questions to you, Mr. First, about the film Annychka. First thing that you said that it belongs to the mainstream films, like as you sort of put it into another bin of these mainstream films, apart from the Ukrainian poetic film. And from what I knew before is that actually this film Annychka also belongs or is thought to belong to the Ukrainian poetic cinema. So I wanted to ask you how, basing on what you put it into this group of more mainstream films, just because it had more had a big revenue from the showing around the Soviet Union, or any other reasons for that? And the other question, what I found very interesting, you say that Annychka is sort of a Soviet reconciliation with Ukrainian nationalism. And I watched this film yesterday, especially for this lecture, and my first thought was, there is so much ideology in it. There is so much propaganda against Hutsuls, sort of. And I was just thinking, okay, if 25 million people around the Soviet Union saw it, then it's a very strong instrument of showing people sort of the horrors of collaboration with fascist Germany. And in the end, the Red Army soldier sort of wins this situation and goes into the future. So that would be my second question. Could you explain more on this reconciliation point that you made? Thank you.
Thanks, Alexei. So first question, I was thinking about your second question and forgot your first question. Could you repeat it? I'm sorry.
About mainstream movie. How do on basing on what you use the term mainstream movie to Annychka?
I gotcha. Yeah, I thought about talking about that more, like how I'm defining mainstream. I'm defining mainstream primarily as a way of making films, right? Like are you using established sort of cinematographic rules and narrative structure, or is it more experimental? And so it takes a question away from the sort of box office success or lack thereof. But I think that's important. Now, is Annychka an example of Ukrainian poetic cinema, or is it socialist realism? Is it mainstream Soviet cinema? And I think in many ways it's both, right? It uses a lot of visual tropes from Ukrainian poetic cinema. It uses, as Oleg pointed out, many of the same actors as other instances of Ukrainian poetic cinema, not only Mikolajchuk, but also Stepankov. And it does this in a sort of quiet, in the same sort of quiet manner that is emblematic of Osika and his stone cross. But at the same time, this is a clear narrative. This is a genre piece. This is a film that is intended with its sort of tight structure to pack audiences into the theater, to give them an entertaining experience, and to propagandize a certain vision of the Great Patriotic War as it was experienced on the Western borderlands. So that's why I'm saying it's a mainstream film in those reasons. So is Billy Ptach's Chornoye Oznakoyo that Natalka Babalik asked in the chat. Yeah, but that failed to generate an audience largely because the authorities didn't like the sort of more compelling vision of the Banderist that was on display in that film. But, you know, and that leads me, I guess, to the second point here, and that is about Roman. Roman is someone who rethinks his collaboration with the Germans, but he does not rethink his sort of connection to Ukraine. And that's what I mean by it doesn't absolve, you know, that horrible, I forget his name now, but the sort of village elder who is the one who forces the partisans to walk on broken glass. You know, it doesn't absolve him. He's evil, right? He's as bad as you can get, but it absolves the dad, right? It absolves Roman. These are people with a moral compass who are doing what they think is right for Ukraine. Okay, and so that's why what I mean by it's a reconciliation, even as it conforms to a broader sort of Soviet Manichaean view of the Red Army versus, you know, the fascists, right? And their Ukrainian toadies. It can be both at the same time, right? It couldn't be otherwise, and still existing as a film that played in theaters in the Soviet Union.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I also I encountered a film director from Estonia, Virve Koppel, and she was very young in the moment when Billy Ptach's Chornoye Oznakoyo went on screens. And she didn't really decipher all the complexities of reconciliation in this film, nationalism, other things, but she was so struck by the visual part of the whole narrative. So the film made her kind of wonder whether this is fairy tale or reality. So she traveled from Estonia to Bukovina to see the real settings. And then she told me in the interview, my God, they really have these colorful outfits. She was so impressed that she thought that this is kind of rather a film. But then she realized that a lot of things really were real in these films. And it's interesting that, especially for the poetic cinema, it had not only Ukrainian audience. We always need to remember that this was also the complex phenomenon. Oleg also used to say that films similar to poetic cinema were common in Georgia, Armenia, and some other republics of the Soviet Union. So this connection to landscape and landscape imaginary, yes, it was very strong in the Soviet cinema of the 60s. We have a question here. Of course, you can read it, but I will read it out for our YouTube audience. So we have a question from Alexei Chebotaryov, who recently defended his thesis on Austro-Russian border. So he thanks you for the scenes from Austro-Russian border, and he is fascinated and will definitely watch the film with Balzac. I also remember watching it when I was a schoolboy. It's a good time to go back to see the film. Then his question sounds as this. I have a general question. Can you also elaborate more on how Soviet films showed political regimes that ruled the Carpathians before 1939? Do you see any patterns in this? Were there any contradictions with the general Soviet historical narratives?
Yeah, I think two good examples of that are, well, first of all is the Ivanov film, Alexei Dovbush, which, the enemies are the Poles in this case. And this, there is no, I mean, this is the party line on Ukrainian history under the Poles. It was incredibly oppressive. They repressed the Ukrainian language. Ukrainians were serfs, and this is the same line that is used in Ivchenko's Bukovina documentary, but with regard to the Romanians. Ivchenko spends an incredibly long time talking about all the different ways in which the Romanians oppressed the Ukrainian people, and it's also in the Ivchenko film Blaue Licht. So some of the earlier scenes are of sort of Romanian oppression. So these are the two big enemies of Western Ukraine: Poles and Romanians. Okay, it doesn't delve too much deeper into Ukrainian history, and I don't see, in my mind, I don't see much diversion. Now, is any of this subversive in any way? I think it could be subversive because the complaints that the filmmakers are lodging against Poles and Romanians is related to Ukrainians' cultural rights. Okay, so in suggesting that oppression looks like this, you might provoke in like an idea that, wait, this is how we're being oppressed now. So it couches a historical critique, or it couches a contemporary critique inside the safe realm of history. And so I think that's where the subversion happens, and not in any sort of use of history. I mean, another example would be Savchenko's Bodan Khmelnytsky, which presents the Poles as these like demonic murderers. So yeah.
Why do you think Hungarians are out of this image in general?
Good question. Hungarians are absent.
Absent, yes. No Hungarians, though they were in the mountains again. Yeah, thank you for these answers. We have a lot of thank you comments on various platforms, so I will not remunerate them. If anybody else has a question or comment, please raise your hand or use your
Asya Pavlenko has a question about Ivchenko, why he was so controversial. Well, Ivchenko sort of made some sort of anti-Semitic comments later in his life. He was actually arrested in New York City for supposedly desecrating a Jewish graveyard cemetery. He said that he was just trying to visit the grave of a friend of his, and they were closed. And so it was a big misunderstanding. But he has said some things that were, it doesn't take much to construe them as anti-Semitic. However, there are Vadim Skorativsky, who's a literary and film critic in Kyiv, was friends with him, and I've talked to him for a lot, and he thinks that Ivchenko is, at the end of the day, a pretty decent guy, and should not be those unfortunate statements should not influence how we see him more generally. But I mean, again, I think that he's been accused of being a sort of ethnic nationalist, of being an anti-Semite, and so on.
Okay, we have also Oleg Chorny trying to say something else. Oh no. You are not muted, so you...
Добре, я хотів трошечки, так би мовити, відмотати назад до питання пана Олексія Ісакова з приводу мейнстрімності і трошечки доповнити пана Джошуа. Бо що стосується мейнстрімності Аннички, дійсно, я тоді вже казав, коли виступав, що це один з касових українських фільмів. І другий касовий фільм Бориса Івченка, у нього їх тільки було 2. Точніше, перший був Анничка, другий Олеся. Все. У нього всі інші картини не збирали таку кількість глядачів, я маю на увазі за показниками навіть по Радянському Союзу. Це перше. Щодо мейнстрімності, тут є чіткий сюжет, в основі якої лежить мелодрама. Це теж основний показник. Чітко визначена жанровість, чого немає ні в «Тінях забутих предків», ні навіть в «Білому птасі». Там воно трошечки розмито. Тут чітко мелодрама. Дівчина, її любить один хлопець, з'являється полонений, в якого вона закохується, і цей персонаж, якого грає Іван Гаврилюк, до речі, теж це ще один представник якраз ваших країв, так би мовити, Західної України, там один з небагатьох в цій кампанії. І жанрова визначеність, і вона гине в кінці, її вбиває батько. Тобто тут це спрацьовує, це абсолютно глядацький жанр, дійсно, який оформлений в різні там метафори, які там є, як пан Джоша сказав, і способи зйомки, так би мовити. І до цього, з приводу поетичного кіно, ви знаєте, це досить таки умовний поділ. Бо існують, так би мовити, я сам намагався розібратися, існують різні списки. Юрій Герасимович Ільченко в своїй книжці називає такий список українського поетичного кіно великий. Я якраз перед сьогоднішнім днем там знайшов один старий журнал, де мій приятель брав інтерв'ю у Параджанова. Він йому задав оце питання, що ви відносите до поетичного кіно. І Параджанов сказав: «Криниця для спраглих, Кам'яний хрест». Ну і зрозуміло, що малися на увазі тіні. І він чітко сказав, на цьому закінчується великий список. Тобто Сергій Йосипович не відніс до цього ні «Білий птах», ні всі наступні картини. Хоча, знову ж таки, там за всіма ознаками до поетичного кіно можна віднести картину мого вчителя «Совість» Володимира Денисенка. Це абсолютний. Те, що Богдан сказав, в інших республіках СРСР, там мольба Тенгіза Абуладзе, до речі, теж про гори, все в горах. І там була історія, що Тенгіз Абуладзе пропонував цю картину знімати Ільченкові, як операторові, побачивши «Криницю для спраглих». Він застосував ту саму технологію цієї плівки мікрат, яка дуже контрастна і зображення графічне. Це дуже схожі візуальні картини. «Криниця для спраглих» і мольба Тенгіза Абуладзе, і ще фінал фільму Денисенка «Совість». Вони всі в схожій зроблені, і знову ж таки Абуладзе знімав Антипенко, який намагався знімати з Параджановим київські фрески, які потім були змиті, збереглося 2 частини. Тобто тут це все пов'язане. Або там в Молдавії Михаїл Калік, який зняв «Людина йде за сонцем». Це типове поетичне кіно, ну, як на мій погляд, але вже урбаністичне.
Okay, I think it's time to finish. We have a lot of various thoughts after this beautiful lecture. I personally start now thinking about why Annychka had to be killed. There is this famous essay by Jacques Rancière about why Madame Bovary had to be killed. And I'm wondering now why she had to be killed. And it's a good subject to think about this. And but yeah, about many other things. And I think not only me, but many of us are very thankful, Joshua, for this interesting and motivating lecture. And I think it's time to end up. And this lecture is recorded, and it will remain on the YouTube channel of the Center for Urban History. So for those who are interested in historical matters and can go back and watch it and listen again. And yeah, we can, you can say a few words for the end, Josh, if you feel like.
Well, thank you once again, Bohdan. Thank you everyone. Thank you, Oleg, for your great comments. I love your recollections, and I appreciate your critique where critique was due. And thanks everyone in the audience. Thanks for the questions, and to be continued, right?
To be continued. Yes. Also, special thanks to the team of the Center for Urban History for making all that we can to make this happen. And I will not enumerate, there are a lot of people involved. But thanks to everybody. Okay, bye-bye.